The phone lines to Tripoli were burning. It was the 22nd of February 2011, and Muammar Gaddafi, the brother leader, the king of kings of Africa, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years through a system of governance so deliberately labyrinthine that it defied conventional political description, was standing before a television camera in the entrance hall of a bombed building, holding an umbrella and telling the world he was still there. The umbrella was important to him. It needed to be understood that the bombing had not made him leave. He was standing in the rubble to prove a point about standing in rubble. Outside, the country was coming apart. Tunisia had fallen in January. Egypt had fallen in February. The wave that would be called the Arab Spring was moving across North Africa with a velocity that had surprised every intelligence service, every government, every analyst who had spent careers studying the region and had concluded that the particular character of its authoritarian arrangements made mass revolt essentially self-defeating. They had been wrong. And now the wave had reached Libya, and in the eastern city of Benghazi, the city that had always regarded Tripoli with a particular historical grievance, that had been systematically neglected and economically starved by Gaddafi's deliberate policy of making no city powerful enough to threaten his own position. In Benghazi, the population had risen. To understand what Gaddafi was facing and what he decided to do with what he was facing, you have to understand the system he had built over 4 decades, because it was a system specifically engineered to make exactly this kind of crisis survivable. He had abolished the army as a conventional institution and replaced it with a network of militias and brigades whose loyalty was purchased personally, whose commanders reported to him directly, and whose organizational structure was deliberately kept fragmented so that no single military figure could accumulate enough independent power to threaten him. He had abolished political parties, abolished civil society institutions, abolished anything that could serve as an organizational framework for opposition. He had distributed oil revenue in ways designed to create personal dependency rather than institutional stability. He had, in the terminology of political science, created a system with almost no intermediate structures between himself and the population, which meant the system was extraordinarily stable until the moment it wasn't, and when it wasn't, there was nothing to catch the fall. He had been in power since 1969. He had taken it at 27 in a military coup against a king he considered corrupt and servile to Western interests, and he had ruled for so long that the Libya he governed was, in almost every institutional sense, simply himself. There was no Libya without Gaddafi in the way, there was no Soviet Union without the party. He was not just the head of the system, he was the system's organizing principle, its ideology, its continuity. And now the eastern half of it was gone. The defections had begun almost immediately when the protests turned violent. Diplomats resigned from Libyan embassies around the world and gave press conferences denouncing him. Military units in the east went over to the rebels. 2 Libyan Air Force pilots ordered to bomb Benghazi flew their jets to Malta instead and landed and walked away. His justice minister resigned on television. His interior minister resigned and joined the opposition. The ambassador to the United Nations, Abdurrahman Shalgam, a man who had served Gaddafi for decades and who visibly did not want to be doing what he was doing, stood before the Security Council and wept and asked the world to save Libya from its leader. The international architecture was moving against him with unusual speed. The Arab League, an organization not historically known for urgency, voted to suspend Libya and request a no-fly zone. The United Nations Security Council on March 17th passed Resolution 1973, authorizing member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians, language that NATO would interpret broadly enough to encompass an air campaign against Gaddafi's ground forces. But before all of that, before the resolution and the airstrikes and the international intervention that would ultimately determine the military outcome, Gaddafi made a decision that crystallized everything about who he was and what he intended to do. He decided to win, not to negotiate, not to offer concessions, not to do what Ben Ali had done in Tunisia or Mubarak had done in Egypt. Read the situation, accept the loss, and leave. He had watched both men fall and had drawn from their falls the opposite conclusion that most observers drew. He did not see Mubarak's departure as a lesson in the wisdom of accommodation. He saw it as a lesson in the cost of hesitation. He believed that Mubarak had fallen because he had wavered, because he had given the protesters the impression that he could be moved, and that if he had been harder and faster, the outcome would have been different. He would not waver. In the speech he gave on February 22nd, unhinged, rambling, operatic, delivered with the particular energy of a man who had spent 42 years performing power and was now performing it for an audience that was actively trying to remove him. He told the Libyan people that he would hunt the rebels house by house, room by room, alley by alley. He called them rats. He called them drug addicts, manipulated by foreign agents and Osama bin Laden. He said he would die as a martyr on Libyan soil. He had a green book on the podium, and he waved it, and he shouted, and his face moved through expressions that the analysts watching around the world found genuinely difficult to categorize. It was, in its way, a completely honest speech. He meant what he said. His forces, in the weeks that followed, demonstrated that he meant it. The military campaign to retake the East moved with a speed that surprised the rebels and alarmed the international community. Gaddafi's brigades, better equipped, better organized, more coherent than the improvised rebel units that had formed around the uprising, pushed east along the coastal road. Town after town fell back. By mid-March, his forces were at the outskirts of Benghazi. He had publicly promised what would happen when they entered. Nobody who had watched his previous suppressions of internal dissent, the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, in which an estimated 1,200 prisoners were killed in a single night, had reason to doubt him. The NATO airstrikes began on March 19th. What followed was a war of a particular modern character, a ground insurgency supported by air power, conducted without NATO ground troops, dependent on rebel forces that were brave and disorganized in roughly equal measure, and extended far beyond what the initial UN resolution had seemed to authorize, or what the contributing governments had initially envisioned. It lasted 7 months. Gaddafi's forces proved resilient. His sons, particularly Qamis and Saif al-Islam, commanded units that fought with a commitment that reflected the specific motivation of men whose survival was identical with their fathers. Tripoli fell in August. Gaddafi fled. He was found on October 20th, 2011, hiding in a drainage pipe in his hometown of Sirte. The circumstances of what followed are documented in video footage that was recorded on multiple phones, and that spread across the internet within hours. He was beaten, he was abused, he was killed. The precise sequence of events and who delivered the fatal shot has never been fully established to legal standards, which is partly because there was no legal process and partly because nobody with the power to investigate had a strong interest in the answer. He had said he would die a martyr on Libyan soil. That part, at least, was accurate. The aftermath of his death produced a Libya that fulfilled almost none of the hopes of those who had genuinely wanted something better, and confounded almost all of those who had predicted it would. The country fractured along tribal, regional, and militia lines. 2 rival governments claimed legitimacy. The oil infrastructure became a bargaining chip in conflicts between armed groups that had no ideological coherence beyond the particular interests of their commanders. The humanitarian situation that the NATO intervention had been justified by reference to preventing became, in different form, the humanitarian situation of the years that followed. Hundreds of thousands of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa passed through a Libya with no functioning state, through detention centers that human rights organizations described in terms that invited direct comparison with historical atrocities. The NATO intervention remains one of the most contested foreign policy decisions of the 21st century, and the contestation is not simple. Those who argue it was wrong must account for what Gaddafi had promised to do in Benghazi, and what his forces were positioned to do when the airstrikes began. Those who argue it was right must account for what Libya became in the decade after he died. There is no position in this argument that does not require you to carry something uncomfortable. Gaddafi himself had, in his last decade, undergone one of the more extraordinary rehabilitations in modern diplomatic history. After the Lockerbie settlement and the abandonment of his weapons of mass destruction program, he had been welcomed, cautiously, then less cautiously, back into the international community. Tony Blair had visited him in his tent. Condoleezza Rice had met with him. Silvio Berlusconi had embraced him with an enthusiasm that reflected both personal temperament and Libyan oil contracts. He had addressed the United Nations General Assembly in 2009 for 96 minutes, far exceeding his allotted time, rambling about the Kennedy assassination and swine flu and the nature of the Security Council. And the delegates had sat, and the cameras had run, and the world had treated him as a head of state because he was one. He had believed, perhaps because of this, that the international community would not move against him. He had believed that his rehabilitation was real, that the relationships were real, that the pragmatic accommodations made with Western governments translated into something like protection. He had misread what those relationships were. They were transactional. When the transaction changed, so did the relationships. There is a version of Gaddafi that his most committed apologists still circulate. The African unity visionary, the anti-imperialist, the man who used oil revenue to build housing and education in a country that had been, before him, desperately poor. These things are not entirely fiction. Libya's human development indicators improved substantially under his early rule. His Pan-African ambitions, however grandiose and ultimately ineffective, came from a genuine conviction rather than pure performance. None of it survives the drainpipe. What his end illustrates with a clarity that is almost too complete to be instructive is the specific terminus of a particular kind of power. The kind that has no off switch, no succession mechanism, no institutional structure that outlasts the individual because the individual has deliberately prevented any such structure from forming. He could not negotiate because negotiation required acknowledging that there was something to negotiate about, and that acknowledgement was the one thing his entire system of self-concept made impossible. He could not leave because he had made himself and Libya synonymous, and leaving Libya was not a thing that parsed in his internal vocabulary. He had a green book and an umbrella and 42 years in a drainage pipe. And at the end, in the footage that the whole world saw, he was asking the men around him, the men who were hitting him, what he had done wrong.